ancient texts reveal a quieter story than the one we usually repeat. A story where the Anunnaki are not arriving in triumph, but moving with measured urgency, as if they are leaving. If you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, from a bed or a couch or a room where the light is low, we can let the noise of modern life fall away. We can take a slower path. We can stand in a place where the air is cool and controlled, where the only sound is the soft friction of sleeves and the faint hum of a building that never truly sleeps. We find ourselves in an archive that smells like clean paper and old dust sealed behind glass. A vault door is reported to sit back from the main corridor, thick as a wall, with a narrow keypad and a small sign reminding staff to log every entry. Inside, a drawer slides open on rails with a gentle resistance. Foam supports cradle a clay tablet the size of a small hand. The surface is a warm brown, fired long ago, its edges softened as if time has been rubbing them with patient fingers. One corner is chipped. A hairline crack crosses the face, not wide enough to swallow a fingernail, but long enough to divide the lines like a fault line. Under a raking light, wedge marks flicker between shadow and shine. It is catalogued, reportedly, with the kind of label that makes an object feel less like a relic and more like a witness. Collection name, drawer number, tray position, and a tablet identifier that looks like a short code rather than a title. It rests on a shelf where everything is arranged by procedure. The tablet is cool to the eye, as if it holds the temperature of stone cellars and nightwork. Along one edge, a faint rolling impression suggests a seal was pressed into the clay while it was still damp. The seal is not decorative in the way a story seal would be. It reads like administration. It reads like authority made physical. This is our cold open, not a temple lit by torches, not a battlefield, not a shining descent from the sky. A tablet in a drawer, a crack across its face, a seal on its edge, an inventory label that insists it belongs to a system. The anomaly is small at first. It is not a monster or a divine threat spelled out in large signs. It is a phrasing that does not match the expected rhythm of routine offerings and ceremonial distribution. In many administrative records, the language is steady and repetitive, as if the scribes are writing from muscle memory. Here, the record is reported to contain an operational note that feels like a switch being thrown. A term appears that belongs more to movement than to devotion, more to removal than to receipt. The structure suggests an action completed quickly, with accountability, as if the tablet exists to prove that a departure was properly executed. What makes this detail break routine is the way it sits inside the document, like an unexpected tool left on a shrine. In a normal cycle, we expect lists of goods, names of officials, quantities measured in familiar units, and the calm confidence of continuity. But this tablet suggests an interruption. It suggests that something or someone was transferred, not celebrated. It suggests that what mattered most was not the offering itself, but the chain of custody. Once we notice this, the tablet stops being a single object and becomes a doorway to a pattern, because the reports from archives and excavation publications, scattered across decades and collections, describe similar pieces of language in other tablets, not identical, not copied in a way that would make us suspicious, but rhyming. A seal here, a courier reference there, a procedural marker that implies closure, suspension, handover, relocation. The pattern is administrative, and administration is where fear often hides best. Myths announce themselves. Protocols try not to. So we widen our lens. We do not drift into fantasy. We do not force the clay to confess what it cannot say. We treat these tablets as a record of how a complex society handled stress. We listen for the sound of emergency procedures in the way a line is structured, in the way a name is ordered, in the way a quantity suddenly narrows, in the way a place name appears where it usually does not. The conventional narrative is familiar. The Anunnaki are often framed as great divine figures, judges of fate, bringers of order, sometimes the architects of humanity's labor. They are spoken of in tones that make them feel timeless and secure, seated above crisis rather than caught inside it. The story is usually told as if power only moves in one direction, down from the gods to the world. But that requires ignoring the ledger voice that creeps into the record. It requires ignoring the administrative insistence on transfer and sealing. It requires ignoring the signs of reduced operational capacity. When what should be abundant is counted carefully. When what should be open is described as closed. When what should be cyclical feels abruptly linear, as if an ending is being documented. We begin forming a careful hypothesis, soft and conditional, because certainty is not our friend here. What if some texts that later generations treated as divine drama began as crisis paperwork? What if the Anunnaki, in certain contexts, function as a category within an institutional system, a term that can be used in both sacred and procedural ways? What if the moments that read like mythic withdrawal are also moments that resemble managed retreat? If we read the phrasing as operational, it suggests that someone important was not simply absent. They were accounted for, rooted, and secured. To test this, we need a method that stays calm. We will examine how tablets are catalogued and how sealing practices indicate control over movement. We will analyze the vocabulary of transfer, withdrawal, storage, and closure, watching for rare terms and strange pairings. We will read king lists and year-naming conventions, not as heroic chronology, but as administrative weather reports, noting gaps and compressions. We will consult laments and epics for the way they preserve institutional memory in poetic clothing. We will pay attention to archaeology, to layers where activity thins, to doorways bricked, to shrines repurposed, to storerooms emptied in a hurry. We will also consider the logic of temple economies, where gods are not only worshipped, but provisioned, and where a change in provisioning can signal a change in presence. Tonight, we keep our feet on the ground. We stay with the artifact as the first witness. The tablet does not shout. It does not announce a cosmic enemy. It does not describe a battle in the sky. It indicates, in the plain language of record-keeping, that something moved, and that someone wanted proof it moved correctly. The crack across the clay becomes part of the story, not as symbolism, but as a reminder of fragility. Clay breaks. Institutions break. Continuity is not guaranteed, it is maintained. When continuity is threatened, People reach for procedure, they seal, they count, they write names in a certain order, they create documentation that can survive a room being abandoned. We linger on that thought because it is the hinge of our investigation. If the Anunnaki were escaping something bigger, we should not expect the tablets to describe it like a modern report. We should expect the pressure to appear indirectly, in the shape of decisions, in the sudden emphasis on chain of custody, in the way movement becomes more important than ceremony. The investigation pauses here in the quiet of the vault. The foam cradle holds the clay. The label holds the identity. The seal holds authority. And the anomaly holds our attention. One question remains, steady and unresolved, like a light left on in an empty office. What kind of world forces a divine category to behave like a department executing a withdrawal protocol? We move from the vault's cool silence into the scribal workshop, not as a romantic scene, but as a place of repeating hands, a room with low benches, reed pens cut to a precise angle, bowls of water, lumps of clay kneaded until they are smooth enough to take an impression without tearing. The work is slow, methodical, and when the system is healthy, it becomes almost musical. The same formats, the same order of information, the same respectful distance between what is sacred and what is counted. A scribe, reported in these reconstructions, learns to keep the columns straight. He learns which determinatives to set in front of names, which signs to use for professions, which marks imply a place rather than a person. He learns the difference between a gift and an allocation, between a sacrifice and a ration, between a celebratory distribution and an emergency issue. The tablet in his hands is not meant to be literature. It is meant to be proof. That is where the second clue emerges, not as a dramatic discovery, but as a single word, a rare term that should not be there, turning up where routine language would normally suffice. The oddness is not only its meaning, but its placement. In administrative texts, position is a kind of grammar. A term placed early can signal priority. A term placed at the end can signal confirmation. A term repeated across witnesses can signal that a new procedure has been introduced. This rare word, as it is reported in scholarly discussions, belongs to the semantic field of withdrawal and removal. It is not the gentle language of offerings presented to a deity. It is closer to inventory language used when something is taken out of circulation and secured elsewhere. The term does not only imply motion, it implies intentional motion under authority. It implies that something was not lost. It was extracted. When we read a word like that, we shouldn't rush to translate it into our modern categories. We should instead ask what it does inside the administrative machine. What paperwork does it trigger? What seals does it require? What officials must sign or witness? In bureaucracies, vocabulary is a switchboard. One term can activate an entire chain of actions. So we widen our sample. We imagine the scribe not as one individual, but as a role distributed across cities. Temples in Mesopotamia were economic engines, as well as religious institutions. They received goods, stored goods, redistributed goods, and kept ledgers to prove that every movement was authorized. If an unusual withdrawal term appears in one archive, it may appear in another when similar conditions occur. not because scribes copy each other casually, but because procedure spreads. When a new protocol is introduced, it arrives with words that must be used precisely to carry legal meaning. The pattern, reported across collections in paraphrase, looks like this. Standard entries list barley, dates, beer, wool, oil, sometimes copper or livestock. Names of officials follow. A seal impression confirms responsibility. Then, in certain clusters, the language tightens. Quantities become smaller and more carefully subdivided. Places appear as destinations rather than origins. The rare withdrawal term appears with references to storage rooms, sealed containers, or controlled access. The tablet begins to read less like religious life and more like continuity planning. Here is another kind of anomaly that tends to ride alongside the rare word. When systems are calm, they lean on abundance. When systems feel pressure, they lean on accountability. We begin to see phrases that indicate verification, witnessing confirmation. We see mentions of couriers and carriers, not as casual laborers, but as entrusted hands. We see notations that suggest a door was closed and a seal applied, not as decoration, but as a barrier. This is where the Anunnaki enter our field of view in a new way, not as glowing figures in a cosmic court, but as a category that can be referenced within the temple economy. The word can carry sacred weight, but it can also function as an institutional label. In some contexts, the Anunnaki are associated with the underworld or with judgment. Those are theological associations. Yet, institutional systems often borrow theological categories as administrative shorthand. A storeroom can be of a deity. An allotment can be for a divine group. A workforce can be assigned to a temple function that bears a divine name. If an administrative tablet indicates that an allotment or inventory is being withdrawn from circulation and associated with a divine category, that doesn't prove gods walked the hallways. It proves that the institution treated that category as real in the only way institutions know how: by assigning goods, space, staff, and procedures to it, by documenting movement. Now we test the conventional narrative again, but in a different place. The familiar story insists that the divine realm is stable and that human affairs are the unstable element. Humans panic, humans flee, humans suffer drought or invasion. The gods remain. Even when gods depart in myths, the departure is framed as a grand moral decision, not a logistical operation. But that requires ignoring the mechanical texture of these records. It requires ignoring the shift from celebratory distribution to controlled issue. It requires ignoring that divine categories appear in the same lines as storage rooms, transport, sealing, and confirmation. It requires ignoring that the scribes are not writing poems. They are leaving audit trails. So we let our hypothesis become slightly sharper without becoming loud. What if, in certain episodes, the institutional world treated the divine presence as something that could be moved, secured, reduced, or reallocated? What if the departure language is not metaphor alone, but a procedural description of how sacred property and sacred authority were bundled for relocation? What if the phrase that sounds like withdrawal reflects a decision to pull critical assets out of a vulnerable location? The phrase escaping something bigger can be held gently here. In a bureaucratic system, there are several kinds of bigger. Bigger can mean an invading army. Bigger can mean famine. Bigger can mean epidemic. Bigger can mean flood. Bigger can mean political collapse, the kind that causes supply lines to fail. The tablets may not name the pressure, but they might show us the institution reacting to it. When a system starts withdrawing core assets and sealing doors, it is responding to a risk it can no longer manage by routine. We can picture an administrator, not divine, but human, standing at the threshold of a storeroom. He knows the temple must remain legitimate, even if the city cannot remain safe. Legitimacy is an asset like grain. It must be protected. He orders the removal of select items. He orders certain records duplicated. He orders seals pressed into clay. The rare withdrawal term becomes the official language for that moment. Another new development emerges when we examine how rare words cluster with time markers. In stable years, entries have an easy relationship with time. They are dated, filed, and forgotten. In stressed periods, time becomes urgent. We start to see compressed sequences, multiple actions recorded close together. The documents begin to reflect a cadence of response rather than a cadence of season. If the Anunnaki were being moved in an administrative sense, it could mean that cult statues, ritual equipment, or key personnel associated with their worship were transferred. It could mean that the institution was consolidating sacred functions into fewer secure nodes. It could mean that certain shrines were being placed into a reduced operational state, with only maintenance issues allowed, while the rest of the system prepared for disruption. The tablets do not say, in plain language, that a cosmic predator was approaching. The tablets do not say that the sky cracked. The tablets indicate something subtler and, in a way, more unsettling. They indicate that people who believed themselves surrounded by divine order still built procedures for retreat. They indicate that even what is most sacred can be handled as cargo when the risk becomes large enough. We come to a quiet close in the scribal room. The reed pen scratches. The clay takes the wedges. A rare term lands in the line like a pebble in a machine. The scribe doesn't pause for drama. He doesn't explain. He simply records, because recording is the only protection he can offer to the future. And one question settles into the silence, steady as a seal pressed into wet clay. What kind of pressure makes an institution treat its highest sacred categories as assets to be withdrawn, secured, and rerouted? We step into the world of seals, not as art, but as control. A cylinder seal is small enough to disappear into a palm, yet it carries the weight of an institution. When rolled across wet clay, it leaves a continuous band of image and sign, like a signature that cannot be forged without access to the object itself. It is also a lock. It does not stop a door from opening, but it proves the door was opened. It does not stop a jar from being unstoppered, but it records who had the right to do it. In storerooms and record rooms, seals are as important as grain. The seal doesn't feed anyone, but it keeps the feeding system legitimate. Without seals, the economy becomes rumor. With seals, it becomes accountable. This matters because a system under pressure begins to seal more, not less. It becomes a world of closures and controlled apertures. The first sign of fear in a bureaucracy is rarely a scream. It is an increase in documentation and the tightening of access. We find a new kind of artifact in the reports: clay ceilings, sometimes called bule, lumps of clay pressed over knots, door latches, jar stoppers, or bundles of documents. They harden into proof. Their surfaces can show chord impressions, the twist of a fiber, the texture of wood or leather. A single ceiling can preserve a moment of closure, the instant a room was secured, the instant a shipment was bound for transit. These ceilings are often broken in the act of opening, which means they are meant to be destroyed. Their purpose is temporary, like a warning that resets only once. So when ceilings survive in deposits, it can suggest a place was left abruptly, a room sealed and never reopened, a package dispatched and never received, a door closed in procedure, then abandoned to history. This is where couriers appear, not as romantic messengers, but as nodes in a network. A courier in an administrative system is a moving link between storerooms and authorities. The courier is trusted because the courier is documented. Names of carriers, lists of what they transported, destinations, witnessing officials, and seals on the package all combine to create a chain of custody. If the chain is intact, the institution can pretend it still controls the world, even if the world is slipping. In calm periods, courier notes are routine. In stressed periods, they become dense. We see more markers of verification. We see more redundancy. We see terms that imply escort, guarded movement, or delivery under supervision. We see that the goods being transported are not only bulk staples, but select items. The kind that would be prioritized if only a limited cargo could move. Now we focus on the gates. Temples and administrative compounds were not open fields. They had thresholds, doors, bars, and protocols for entry. Some gates were symbolic, some were functional, and many were both. A gate can be an architectural feature, but it can also be a point of regulation, a place where lists are checked and seals are inspected. The anomaly in this domain is the language of closure, phrases that imply a gate was shut, a door sealed, a space placed under restriction. The terms are not poetic, they are procedural. They suggest that access was reduced, that movement was being channeled rather than allowed. When a system begins to limit entry and document departures, it is making a decision about risk. It is treating the outside as uncertain. We can imagine the soundscape, not battle horns, not collapsing walls. Instead, the dull thud of a bar set into brackets, the scrape of a door, the press of a seal into wet clay, the quiet voice of an official calling out names as couriers line up, each holding a tablet or a bundle. The anxiety is not chaotic. It is managed. Here, the Anunnaki are felt not as a pantheon in the clouds, but as a label attached to what must be protected. The administrative system might treat certain cultic objects as belonging to a divine group, and the movement of those objects would be recorded with the same care as the movement of metal or textiles. If the system believed that legitimacy depended on maintaining the presence of these sacred assets, then moving them would be a form of survival, a controlled exit, not a collapse. The conventional story of divine departure often frames the gods as choosing to leave because humans failed. It is moral, not logistical. It assumes that when the gods withdraw, humans simply endure the consequences. But the ceilings suggest something else. They suggest preparation. They suggest human hands managing the mechanics of withdrawal. They suggest that the institution believed it could carry sacred authority through a crisis by transporting the physical and administrative anchors of that authority. This does not require us to believe in flying machines or secret star routes. It requires only that we recognize a basic principle of temple economies. Divine presence is maintained through ritual, and ritual is maintained through objects, personnel, space, and schedule. If the schedule breaks, the presence is threatened. If the objects are lost, the presence is compromised. If the personnel scatter, the knowledge dissolves. So in a crisis, the system tries to move the minimum set of things needed to restart ritual elsewhere. That minimum set is a kind of portable continuity. We now consider a different sort of evidence, one that rarely gets attention from storytellers: the physical clustering of ceilings. In some excavated contexts, ceilings are found in piles or concentrations, like the remnants of a records office, a mass of broken proof. This can happen in normal administrative practice, but certain concentrations feel like a final accounting, a last day of business where many packages were sealed at once, where doors were closed in sequence, where the office produced an unusual volume of control artifacts, and then stopped. If the bigger pressure is approaching, we would expect to see these behaviors: increased sealing, more courier traffic, restricted access, prioritization of select cargo. The system behaves as if it is pulling its center inward, preparing to move its core while shedding what it cannot carry. This is where we let our hypothesis breathe in a careful way. What if the texts that later become myth preserve the memory of an institutional retreat? And the gods in those texts are not only metaphysical beings, but the names of functions, sanctuaries, and legitimacy packages. If the Anunnaki are referenced in association with sealed transfers, then the escape could be a controlled relocation of a divine portfolio. The something bigger could be any force that makes a city untenable, a flood that breaks the fields, a siege that cuts the canals, a disease that thins the workforce, a political fracture that turns allies into threats. We still do not claim to know which pressure it was. We only notice that the administrative behavior is consistent with anticipation. In a sudden catastrophe, people flee with what they can grab. In a managed withdrawal, people seal, list, assign carriers, witness, confirm, and close gates in an orderly progression. The evidence we are tracking belongs to the second category. The atmosphere remains quiet. We stand in a corridor between storerooms, where the air is dusty and the light is narrow. We touch nothing. We only observe. A broken ceiling on the floor holds an impression of authority that once mattered enough to protect. A courier line, reconstructed from names and destinations, points outward like a vein searching for a safer heart. And one question remains, steady and practical, the kind that lives inside institutions. When a gate is closed and a package is sealed, who decided what was essential enough to carry? And what risk was large enough to justify leaving a sacred center behind? We enter a place where stories and ledgers occupy the same shelves. In many modern minds, myth lives in one room and accounting lives in another. But in the ancient temple world, those rooms share a doorway. A hymn can authorize an offering. A ritual calendar can dictate labor. A divine name can stand on a ration list. The same institution that recites cosmology also measures barley. This is why contradictions matter. Not contradictions in belief, but contradictions in operational behavior. We listen to the conventional tale people like to tell. The Anunnaki are imagined as a fixed council, judges of destinies, high administrators of the universe. Their presence feels permanent. Their authority feels like stone. In this telling, crises belong to humans. Humans starve. Humans fight. Humans flood. The divine realm remains an overseeing order, sometimes punishing, sometimes rescuing, but always in control. Then the ledgers intrude with their plain voice. They describe rationing. They describe reduced distributions. They describe careful allocation to specific roles. They sometimes suggest that certain groups are being kept functional, while others are allowed to lapse. In a healthy year, the institution can afford generosity. In a stressed year, it cannot. It begins triage. Triage has a particular scent in administrative language. It shows up in categories. Certain workers receive full rations, others receive partial. Some are listed as absent, transferred, or no longer in service. The ledger does not moralize. It documents. And when we see the system narrowing its support, we are looking at a temple economy behaving like an organization under threat. A new development emerges when we look at how food and labor are linked. In temple systems, rations are not only sustenance, they are payment. A contract between institution and worker. When rations change, the social order changes. A sudden reduction in rations can mean diminished harvests. It can also mean disrupted transport, loss of storage, or a decision to conserve for a smaller core group. Sometimes the very format of ration texts shifts, becoming more compressed, more urgent, or more focused on specific recipients. This is where the contradiction becomes sharp enough to feel. The conventional story says divine authority is steady and expansive. The ledger behavior suggests an institution shrinking its operational footprint. It suggests contraction, a pulling inward. It suggests that whatever legitimacy the institution carries, it is being preserved in a smaller container. We now hold 3 contradictions in the palm of our hand, each one quiet but weighty. The first contradiction is that divine categories appear beside ration language. If the Anunnaki are only cosmic judges, why do we find their names or related categories in proximity to distributions and provisioning? That proximity suggests institutional integration. It suggests that the divine realm, at least in administrative practice, is handled through resources and schedules. When resources become scarce, the divine realm becomes subject to managerial decisions. The second contradiction is the rise of procedural verification. In stable times, the system relies on habit. In stressed times, it relies on proof, more seals, more witnesses, more confirmations. A divine order that is truly unshakable would not require increased bureaucratic reinforcement. Increased reinforcement implies anxiety about continuity. The third contradiction is the appearance of what can be described as reduced capacity. That can show up as fewer personnel listed, fewer deliveries recorded, or more frequent notes of absence and movement. It can also show up archaeologically as spaces used differently, storerooms emptied, workshops quiet. The myth says the divine realm holds the world steady. The evidence suggests the institution is struggling to hold itself steady. The phrase escaping something bigger becomes, in this environment, less about a dramatic chase and more about a systemic decision. When capacity drops, organizations decide what to preserve. They prioritize core functions. They defer secondary functions. They maintain symbolic continuity while letting less visible operations fail. Now we introduce a different kind of text, not a ledger and not a myth, but the in-between, ritual instructions, calendars, lists of offerings by day. These documents can reveal stress in subtle ways. If a temple's calendar becomes irregular, if offerings are reduced or substituted, if a feast becomes smaller, it suggests supply issues or security issues. Substitution is particularly telling. When the standard offering cannot be provided, the system offers an acceptable replacement. That is not only theology, it is logistics. If certain offerings are replaced with cheaper goods, it may indicate scarcity. If offerings are moved to different locations, it may indicate threat to the original sanctuary. If certain ceremonies are postponed, it may indicate that the workforce is no longer available, or that the roads are not safe enough for processions, or that the leadership has shifted focus to survival. This is not an argument for fantasy. It is an argument for reading sacred practice as a living system. Sacred systems have supply lines. They have labor rosters. They have storage requirements. When a pressure grows large, sacred systems respond the way other systems respond. They simplify. They consolidate. They protect the core. We can imagine the temple as a ship in rising water. The crew does not abandon it immediately. They close watertight doors. They move cargo to higher decks. They restrict movement between compartments. They issue rations. They keep the lights on in key rooms and let other rooms go dark. The ship is still the ship, but it is now in emergency mode. This is where the Anunnaki in the narrative can take on a new resonance. If the divine council is described as departing, it could mirror the institution's experience of reduced ritual capacity. The gods leaving can be the felt reality of ceremonies no longer performed, of statues removed, of offerings discontinued, of sacred presence relocated. The departure is experienced as metaphysical, but it is enacted through administration. We hold our hypothesis gently. If we read this as a managed withdrawal, then the Anunnaki are not simply abandoning humans out of contempt. The institution is making a decision to relocate what it can, to preserve continuity under conditions that overwhelm normal routines. The something bigger could be environmental collapse. It could be military threat. It could be internal political fracture. It could be a compound crisis where several pressures arrive at once. The evidence does not tell us which. It tells us how the system behaved. We move through a storeroom that is now only a concept, rebuilt in the mind from lists of goods and from the architecture of foundations. We can smell grain dust. We can hear the shuffle of sandals. We can feel the tension in the way officials speak in short phrases, because there is no time for ornament. A ration list is compiled, a seal is applied, a substitute offering is approved, a labor group is reassigned. The investigation rests in that atmosphere, not in spectacle, but in managerial strain. A final question remains, quiet and unresolved, like a ledger left open on a table. If an institution can make divine presence portable through objects and procedures, what happens to belief when the portable core is removed and the remaining population is left with the shell? We arrive at Eridu in the mind first, because the site itself is a layered argument. It is reported as one of the oldest sacred centers in southern Mesopotamia, a place where long sequences of rebuilding created a stack of flaws like a slow heartbeat. Each rebuild is an assertion of continuity. Each layer says, "We are still here. The rituals still hold. The institution still has a center." But a long-lived center is also where changes become readable. In a newer city, a crisis can erase the record. In an old city, the record is thick enough to show how procedures evolved under stress. We do not need to imagine a single catastrophic moment. We can look for subtle shifts, the kinds of shifts administrators make when they sense instability. A doorway narrowed, a storeroom reorganized, a work area moved inward, a pathway redirected. These are not cinematic gestures. They are operational decisions. Eridu's value as an anchor is that it sits at the intersection of myth and administration. It is associated with deep, sacred narratives, but it is also a real place with mud brick walls, canals, and the slow grind of provisioning. The temple at Eridu, as it is reconstructed, would have required constant inflow of goods and labor. Grain must come in, offerings must be prepared, tools must be maintained, textiles must be produced, ritual calendars must be met. A temple cannot float above economics. It is tied to the fields and the roads. A new development emerges when we consider what happens to a temple economy when the environment shifts. Southern Mesopotamia depends on water control. Canals, levees, and irrigation channels are lifelines. If water becomes unreliable, everything becomes unreliable. Salinization can degrade fields over time. Floods can destroy infrastructure quickly. Drought can reduce yields. Even small changes in water availability ripple through ration lists, labor rosters, and maintenance schedules. So we look for signs of a quiet alarm, not in a single dramatic inscription, but in patterns of construction and use in many sites. The relationship between sacred space and storage space changes over time. Early phases may emphasize open ritual areas. Late phases may emphasize storerooms, controlled access, and defensive architecture. If a temple begins to behave like a fortress of supplies, it implies that supplies are no longer guaranteed. Eridu is also a place where the boundary between sacred and administrative can tighten. When risk grows, institutions often move their critical functions closer to the center. They reduce the number of thresholds. They simplify routes. They limit access to certain rooms. The goal is to keep control even if the outer environment becomes unstable. We can imagine walking through the compound at night when the city is quiet. The canal water is black. The air smells of wet clay and reeds. A guard stands near an entry, not in ceremonial attire, but in practical readiness. Inside, an official checks a storage seal with a thumb, not breaking it, only testing whether it is intact. A scribe waits with a tablet, prepared to record any change. The mood is not celebratory. It is careful. The Anunnaki, in this frame, are not a spectacle in the sky. They are a category of sacred authority that must be preserved, in an old center like Eridu. Preserving authority might mean preserving the objects and procedures that tie the institution to the divine order. If those objects are moved, the move would be justified as necessary for continuity. The departure would be framed in sacred language, but its mechanics would be economic and architectural. Now we turn to the ground itself, because layers can show stress in physical ways. A sudden abandonment can leave behind unfinished work, tools dropped, rooms left with goods still inside. A managed withdrawal can leave a different signature. The storerooms might be emptied, the valuable items removed, doors sealed, archives consolidated, ritual spaces cleaned and closed. The last phase can look orderly rather than chaotic. In a site like Eridu, if there is evidence reported of careful closure in certain phases, it becomes meaningful. A temple that is truly destroyed by surprise often carries disorder in its final deposit. A temple that is intentionally decommissioned can carry silence. The shelves are empty. The floors are swept. The doors are shut. The final layer is quiet. We also consider the administrative rhythms around maintenance. Temples require constant repair. Mud brick erodes, plaster flakes, roof beams rot. Maintenance texts and work organization reflect whether the institution has enough labor to keep up. If maintenance becomes sporadic, if repairs are patchy rather than thorough, it suggests reduced capacity. It suggests that skilled labor is being diverted or has become scarce. If the institution at Eridu begins to prioritize certain repairs over others, that prioritization is a clue. It tells us what the administrators considered essential. Perhaps they strengthen storerooms while allowing outer walls to weaken. Perhaps they rebuild a sanctuary core but reduce surrounding workshops. Perhaps they create more internal partitions. Each choice implies a model of risk. The conventional mythic framing tends to treat sacred centers as eternal until they are punished. But administrative behavior suggests something more gradual and more human. It suggests that leaders sensed instability and adapted. The divine language of departure can be a way of making adaptation feel authorized. If a cult statue is moved for safety, it can be described as the deity choosing to travel. If a ritual calendar is reduced, it can be described as the deity withholding presence. Sacred explanation can mask logistical necessity while still preserving communal coherence. We allow ourselves a careful hypothesis again. What if Eridu's long sacred sequence includes phases where the temple behaves like a system preparing for interruption? What if the architectural shifts and maintenance patterns are the physical shadow of the same administrative signals we have been tracking? If so, then escaping something bigger is not a single event. It is a posture. It is the institution slowly tightening its procedures and consolidating its core. The bigger pressure might be environmental. It might be political. It might be a compound. The important detail is not the label, but the response. The response is controlled movement, restricted access, prioritization of portable legitimacy. We can imagine the selection process. Officials would decide what can be carried and what cannot. Heavy grain jars might be left. Sacred items small enough to transport would be prioritized. Key tablets and seals would be essential. Certain personnel, trained in ritual and administration, would be routed along safe paths. The institution would aim to reconstitute itself elsewhere, even if the original center becomes untenable. In that moment, the Anunnaki are not only beings, they are a claim. They are the claim that the institution still has authority, even if it has moved. The physical movement of that claim can be framed as divine travel, but it is also a continuity strategy. We stand at the edge of an imagined courtyard. The mud brick walls hold the day's heat and release it slowly. A storeroom door is shut. Clay on the latch holds a seal impression that will harden by morning. The canal reflects a thin strip of starlight. Inside the compound, voices are low. The way voices become low when people do not want fear to spread. The investigation settles on one final question, quiet and steady, like a lamp burning in a corner. If a sacred center as old as Eridu begins to act as if continuity must be made portable, what kind of world makes even the oldest institutions prepare to move? We turn from walls and storerooms to lists of kings, because political time is another kind of artifact. A king list looks simple on the surface. Names in sequence, lengths of reign, a claim that authority moved from one city to another like a torch, passed hand to hand. Many people read these lists as mythology or propaganda, and they are that. But they are also an administrative attempt to stitch order across instability. A list is a bridge built out of names. In an orderly world, a list is a summary. In a fractured world, a list is a repair. The act of writing continuity is itself evidence that continuity was threatened. This is why we pay attention to gaps, compressions, and irregularities, not as trivia, but as signals of administrative stress. A new development emerges when we consider year names. In some Mesopotamian systems, years were not numbered. They were named after notable events, often state achievements, temple dedications, military victories, canal works, or offerings. The year name is a form of public memory and administrative indexing at once. It allows documents to be dated without numbers, and it allows the state to declare what mattered. When year names become repetitive, vague, or suddenly focused on survival tasks, it can indicate pressure. When year naming sequences break or become inconsistent across regions, it can indicate political fragmentation. When there are stretches where documentation thins, it can indicate a period when the state apparatus could not maintain its record flow. We are not looking for a single missing year like a smoking crater. We are looking for a change in texture. The administrative machine has a normal hum. When that hum falters, it leaves distortions in the paper trail, or, in this case, in the clay trail. Imagine a records room where tablets are stored by year. Each shelf is a slice of time. In a stable period, the shelves are full, the formats consistent, the handwriting familiar. In a stressed period, the shelves might thin, the handwriting might vary, the formats might simplify. The number of documents might drop, not because nothing happened, but because the system couldn't afford to document everything. In crisis, people do the work first and write later, if later exists. King lists can also hide anxiety under grand claims. If a list insists that kingship descended smoothly, but the archaeological record shows destruction layers, population shifts, or abrupt changes in material culture, then the list is doing ideological work. It is smoothing a rupture. That smoothing is itself a clue. Now we bring the Anunnaki into this domain of political time. In some traditions, divine councils are connected with the bestowal of kingship. Authority is not only political, it is sacral. If divine legitimacy is thought to authorize rulers, then any disruption in political sequence threatens more than governance. It threatens the cosmic order as understood by the society. In such a framework, managing the narrative of continuity becomes essential. This is where escaping something bigger can show up in the logic of official memory. If a disruption occurs that is too destabilizing to name directly, institutions often encode it. They compress it into vague phrases. They shift attention to safe achievements. They use ritual language to translate fear into authority. In year names, a major catastrophe might be masked by a dedication, a canal repair, or a vow fulfillment. Not because those things were unimportant, but because they are controllable. A catastrophe is not controllable. A dedication is. We examine what happens when kingship is described as moving. In king lists, power relocates between cities. That can reflect real shifts in political dominance. But it can also reflect administrative relocation in response to crisis. If a city becomes untenable due to environmental collapse or threat, governance may move, archives may move, sacred assets may move. The list then reads like destiny, but it may also be a record of retreat. Another new development appears when we think about contested kingship. In times of stability, succession is clear. In times of instability, multiple claimants arise, regions fracture, cities assert autonomy. In such periods, documentation can become partisan, and lists become weapons. A king list might omit rivals, shorten reigns, or rearrange sequence to produce a narrative of legitimacy. These distortions can indicate not only political competition, but the underlying stress that created the competition. The administrative signals of stress include abrupt changes in titles, the appearance of emergency officials, or shifts in the distribution of resources toward military or protective functions. Even if the surviving tablets are sparse, the pattern of what survives can be telling. A rise in texts about provisioning, labor conscription, fortification work, or relocation of goods can signal that the state is in defensive posture. We treat the king list as a map with missing roads. The missing roads are where the pressure lived. The list might glide over years of chaos with a single name. It might assign impossibly long reigns to early figures and then abruptly become more realistic, suggesting that the list is part mythic framework and a part administrative patchwork. We do not mock it for this. We read it as evidence of a society trying to keep time coherent while time was breaking. Now we shift into a more intimate scene of record keeping. A scribe receives news that a city's authority is no longer secure. He still has to date documents. He still has to file them. If the year-naming convention is contested, he must choose which authority to recognize. That choice is political risk. The clay tablet becomes a declaration of allegiance. In crisis, even a date line can be dangerous. If the Anunnaki represent divine authorization of kingship, then a disruption in kingship can be felt as divine withdrawal. The gods leaving can be a way to describe the collapse of legitimacy, but the administrative documents might show that legitimacy did not simply collapse. It was managed. It was transferred. It was sealed. It was carried to a new center and declared intact. We hold the hypothesis softly. What if the mythic language of divine councils and departing gods is one way to narrate the fact that political authority and sacred authority were forced to relocate under pressure? The bigger pressure may not be named, but its shape can be inferred from the administrative distortions, gaps, compressions, relocations, contested sequences. The evidence remains indirect, and that is important. If a threat is overwhelming, naming it directly may be socially dangerous. It can spread panic or undermine authority. Institutions often prefer to encode the threat in procedure and narrative, rather than announce it plainly. The result is a record that speaks in side channels. The king list speaks in omissions. The year names speak in substitutions. The ledgers speak in rationing. The ceilings speak in closure. We end in the quiet of an archive shelf again, but now the shelf is time itself. Tablets line up like silent witnesses. Names of kings form a spine. Some segments are dense with detail. Others are thin. The pattern is not random. It is the contour of a system under strain, trying to keep continuity believable. One question remains, steady and unresolved, like a dateline left blank. When political time begins to fracture, and the record tries to stitch it back together with sacred authority, what kind of pressure is large enough to make legitimacy itself behave like something that must be relocated? We enter the city laments through their tone, because tone can be evidence. A lament is not an administrative tablet, but it carries the memory of administration like a shadow under poetry. It is composed to be performed, to move a listener, to explain loss without turning it into meaningless ruin. It gives a city a voice. It gives temples a voice. It gives walls and canals the ability to grieve. Yet, beneath the ritualized sorrow, laments often preserve the anatomy of collapse in ways that ledgers cannot. A new development appears when we treat laments as incident reports written in a ceremonial register. Not because the poets were clerks, but because they lived inside institutions. They knew the cadence of offerings. They knew what happens when gates close. They knew what it means when processions stop. They knew how silence spreads when storerooms empty and workshops go dark. When they describe a city's life failing, they often do it in sequences that resemble operational failure cascades. We listen for the order of events. A lament will often move from the divine realm to the human realm, from decision to consequence. The gods withdraw. The protective presence lifts. Then the city's mechanisms fail. People scatter. Fires burn. But the important detail is the middle layer, the infrastructure layer, where the poem notices the stoppage of routine. The temple kitchens no longer produce, the granaries no longer open, the music and festivals cease, the waterworks break, the roads are unsafe, the labor force is disrupted. These are not purely symbolic statements. They map onto the real dependencies of a city. In this map, divine departure functions as a narrative wrapper around systemic failure. The gods leaving is how the society explains why its routines stopped working. Yet, The laments often contain details that feel like procedural memory. Mentions of doors shut, of sacred items no longer in place, of priests unable to perform, of offerings cut off. These are not just metaphors. They are the lived consequences of a managed withdrawal or a forced cessation. We approach the Anunnaki through the lament register. In some lines, the divine council is portrayed as making a decision, sometimes reluctant, sometimes compelled. That portrayal can be read as theological drama, but it can also be read as an institutional memory of deliberation. In a crisis, temple leadership would meet. Civic leadership would meet. They would decide what to move, what to secure, what to abandon. The lament may transpose that meeting into the divine realm to preserve legitimacy. If leaders decide to relocate sacred assets, it is safer to say the gods chose to depart. This is not a cynical reading. It is a compassionate one. People under stress need meaning. They need a story that does not reduce their loss to random cruelty. By framing the withdrawal of protection as a divine decision, the lament gives shape to chaos. At the same time, the lament preserves clues about what was done on the ground. A new development emerges when we examine the language of pathways. Laments frequently speak of roads, gates, and canals as active participants. Roads that once carried processions now carry refugees. Gates that once welcomed now exclude. Canals that once fed fields now become barriers or empty channels. These details are operational. They indicate movement patterns and the breakdown of controlled circulation. Yet they also hint at intentional control. Because a city under threat often restricts its gates, channels its roads, and regulates who can enter. We can imagine a night council in a temple room. Lamps burn low. Officials speak quietly. Someone mentions the storerooms. Someone mentions the route to a safer city. Someone mentions the need to preserve the cult's legitimacy. The decision is not only about goods. It is about identity. If the sacred core can be moved, the city can die, and the institution can still live. The lament, later performed, encodes that decision as divine departure. It makes the human choice bearable. Now we listen for a particular pattern. The lament's attention to what is missing. In a thriving city, rituals are loud. Bells, drums, chanting, cooking, animal sounds, crowds. When the lament describes silence, it is describing a specific kind of absence. Silence means the ritual stopped. That is not just emotional. It is procedural. It implies that the calendar was broken, the supply chain disrupted, the personnel scattered, or the sacred objects removed. Silence in a lament can also suggest intentional shutdown. A forced shutdown due to danger can leave the same silence as a deliberate decommissioning. The difference lies in the way the poem describes the transition. Some laments preserve a sense of sequence, as if certain parts of the city were emptied first, certain sanctuaries left later, certain thresholds crossed with awareness. That sense of sequence aligns with managed withdrawal rather than pure panic. The something bigger in this environment becomes less like a monster and more like a pressure that makes protection impossible. The lament's divine language can hint at compulsion. The gods are not always portrayed as gleeful abandoners. Sometimes they are portrayed as constrained by higher order, by fate, by a cosmic rule. That motif can be read as theology. But it can also reflect the reality that human leadership felt constrained by forces beyond control. An invasion army cannot be argued with. A flood cannot be negotiated. A disease cannot be bribed. A collapsing irrigation system cannot be repaired overnight. When leaders say, "we cannot hold," that is a form of compulsion. The lament may translate it into divine necessity. We now consider the lament's administrative vocabulary. Even in poetic form, certain words recur that belong to institution life: assembly, decree, decision, boundary, gate, storehouse, offering, priesthood. When these terms appear, they tie the poem to the procedural world. The poet is not inventing a fantasy city. He is documenting the failure of an institutional machine. This matters for our hypothesis because it suggests that the concept of divine departure is not separate from the reality of administrative retreat. The Anunnaki, as a council, can reflect the human need to model decisions as legitimate, structured, and authorized. If the sacred core is moved, the poem can say the council agreed. If the city is left behind, the poem can say the council withdrew protection. The emotional truth and the operational truth can coexist. We move through the lament, not as readers seeking a climax, but as investigators tracking signals. We note the emphasis on thresholds. We note the descriptions of sanctuaries no longer inhabited. We note the shift from abundance imagery to scarcity imagery. We note the grief that is anchored in specific routines that stopped. In the end, the lament leaves us with a calm but unsettling realization. A city's collapse is not only a moment of violence. It is the unthreading of schedules, supply, and legitimacy. The lament preserves that unthreading in a voice meant to be heard by the living, so they can accept what happened and rebuild meaning elsewhere. One question remains, steady as a chant repeated in a dark hall. If the laments encode deliberation and controlled cessation under sacred language, what kind of pressure is large enough that even the poets describe the divine council as compelled to withdraw? We take a different text into our hands now, one that carries catastrophe in its bones, but also carries procedure in its joints. Atrahasis is often remembered as a flood narrative, a story about gods, noise, overpopulation, and a drastic reset. People tend to hear it as a mythic explosion, a storm of divine anger. Yet, if we listen closely in a calmer register, the narrative also preserves the logic of containment. It preserves the idea that a crisis can be managed through thresholds, restrictions, and controlled information. A new development appears when we treat the story's divine decisions as a model of institutional crisis response. The gods meet, they deliberate, they attempt incremental measures, they escalate when incremental measures fail. This is not only mythic drama, it is a recognizable sequence in organizational behavior. First, try to regulate, then attempt to suppress, then move to drastic intervention, even if we hold the supernatural elements as literary. The decision logic resembles a system reacting to an overwhelming variable. The variable in atrahasis is often framed as human noise, but that framing can be read as a metaphor for population pressure, labor demands, resource strain, and the friction of crowded systems. When too many mouths depend on irrigation and grain storage, the margin for error narrows, disease spreads faster, supply disruptions become catastrophic, conflicts intensify. In such a context, noise can be a symbolic shorthand for systemic overload, Now we focus on the language of limits. The narrative includes measures that reduce fertility, increase mortality, or constrain growth. These are horrifying in implication, but we do not linger on cruelty. We examine the procedural shape. The story does not describe random destruction at first. It describes policy like interventions. That is the key. Policy implies management. Management implies that the crisis is not simply a moral event. It is an operational event, framed as moral. The flood itself is presented as a totalizing solution. But even within the flood narrative, there are signs of controlled preservation. A selection is made. A vessel is built. Specific instructions are given. Materials are listed. Timing matters. The vessel becomes an emergency container, a mobile continuity unit. That is not a modern term, but the function is familiar. When a system anticipates collapse, it builds a container to preserve core assets through disruption. We do not claim that the story is literal engineering. We treat it as memory-shaped into narrative. The important thing is that the story imagines survival as a planned extraction rather than a lucky accident. The survivor is not simply the strongest. The survivor is the one informed and prepared. That emphasis on informed preparation is a form of controlled disclosure. It implies that not everyone is told. It implies that certain knowledge is restricted to preserve order. This is where the escaping something bigger idea changes shape. It no longer reads like a chase. It reads like a containment event where leadership decides who receives warning and who does not, because full disclosure could cause collapse before the flood even arrives. In institutional crises, secrecy can be a tool of stability. Information is a resource that can destabilize if released without control. We also notice the narrative's concern with oaths and binding statements. Oaths appear as tools that limit what can be said and who can say it. In the story, divine authorities attempt to restrict disclosure. Yet, disclosure still occurs through a workaround, a mediated communication that preserves the oath's letter while violating its spirit. This is a remarkable detail because it shows an awareness of procedure and loopholes. It shows that even divine governance can be constrained by its own rules. And that crisis response can involve controlled leaks. The Anunnaki, in some traditions, are part of the divine administration. Whether they appear explicitly in every version or hover as a background council category, the concept of a governing divine body is central. If we read the story through an administrative lens, the gods are not only characters, they are offices. They represent decision-making layers. They represent the tension between policy and consequence. A new development emerges when we examine the aftermath logic. After the catastrophe, the system does not simply restart in chaos. It implements controls to prevent recurrence, limits on population, new rules about mortality and fertility. This is containment policy. It suggests the crisis is framed as an operational problem that requires ongoing regulation. In other words, the catastrophe is not the end of management. It is the justification for management. If we translate this into our investigative frame, the something bigger could be a force that makes previous norms unsustainable. The response is not only escape, but reconfiguration, withdrawal, and redesign. If a divine category is depicted as leaving or changing its relationship to humans, that could reflect the institution's need to restructure itself after systemic shock. The new world has new constraints. We now consider the vessel motif again, because it resembles the logic of portable legitimacy. A vessel preserves seeds, animals, people, or knowledge, depending on the telling. This mirrors the way institutions select what to carry when a center collapses. You cannot carry everything. You choose the core. You preserve a functioning minimum. You move through the dangerous interval. Then, you attempt reconstitution. The narrative also contains timing signals. Not just that a flood happens, but that there is a window. There is a moment to build, to load, to seal, to depart. The emphasis on sealing is important. Sealing creates a boundary between inside and outside. It is a containment act. It is also an act of trust, because once sealed, you cannot easily change what you chose to carry. The selection becomes fate. We can imagine the psychological experience encoded here. People sense a larger pressure, larger than any single city can resist. They imagine it as a flood, because flood is what makes walls irrelevant. Flood is what makes borders dissolve. Flood is what makes the outside become everywhere. A flood is the perfect metaphor for an overwhelming system-level threat. If the Anunnaki were escaping something bigger, the flood story suggests a conceptual model. The bigger thing is not fought. It is outlasted by moving into a sealed container and preserving core assets until the wave passes. Whether the wave is water, war, famine, or social collapse, the response is the same. Extract what matters, seal it, move it, keep it alive. We end in a quiet space of controlled instruction. The story's voice becomes procedural, even when the imagery is cosmic. Build this way, use these materials. Enter at this time, seal it, wait, survive, then rebuild with new rules. The emotional temperature is still intense, but the logic is calm. It is management under catastrophe. One question remains, steady as the sound of rain on a sealed roof. If the narrative preserves containment logic, and if disclosure is restricted to preserve order, what kind of pressure makes a governing council, divine or human, treat survival as a selective and sealed operation? We lean closer to the margins now, because margins are where systems whisper. A scribe writes the main line to satisfy procedure, but the margin can hold what procedure cannot comfortably say. A small correction, a clarification of a name, a note about condition or exception, a determinative that shifts meaning with a single wedge, a sign added later, pressed in with a different hand, as if urgency arrived after the fact. A new development emerges when we treat these small marks as pressure signatures. In calm administration, formats are stable and margins stay quiet. In stressed administration, exceptions multiply. Goods arrive late. People are absent. Roads are unsafe. Storerooms are compromised. Decisions are revised midstream. The result is a rise in marginal qualifiers. Not dramatic statements, but tiny amendments that show the system straining to keep its own records truthful. We focus on determinatives, those silent classifiers that tell us whether a word is a person, a place, a god, a profession, a material. Determinatives are bureaucratic tools. They reduce ambiguity. Yet, when determinatives are applied inconsistently, or when an unusual determinative appears. It can reveal uncertainty or intentional reframing. If a term associated with divine categories begins to be marked in ways that suggest location or object rather than personhood, it can indicate a shift from theology to logistics. If a name that should be divine is treated as cargo, the record may be hinting at movement of a cult object, a statue, or a sealed bundle representing sacred authority. We do not claim direct access to the tablets tonight. We rely on reported patterns in how scribes worked and what kinds of notations appear in archives. The key idea is that the margin is where we can sometimes see the institution negotiating reality. Now we consider transfer markers, the phrases that indicate movement from one custody to another. In stable periods, transfer language can be routine, but in a period of fear, transfer language becomes highly formal. It may specify not only who gave and who received, but under what authority, in what condition, with what sealing. Condition is the subtle point. When an item is moved because it is valuable, condition matters. When an item is moved because it is threatened, condition becomes urgent. Notes about damage, contamination, incompleteness, or urgency can appear. This is where the bigger pressure can be felt without being named. If goods are moved with notes indicating they must be kept separate, kept sealed, kept away from certain spaces, it suggests a containment logic. If certain transfers include unusual restrictions or unusual destinations, it suggests that normal safe places were no longer safe. We now add another kind of evidence, the language of assembly and consensus. In many institutional cultures, major decisions require an assembly, a council, a set of witnesses. When a text indicates that an action was performed by decision or by decree, it implies that the action might be contested or risky. Routine actions do not need emphasis. Contested actions do. If a record emphasizes that a transfer was approved by higher authority, it suggests that the transfer was not normal. It suggests someone anticipated later accusations or doubt. The Anunnaki, in this landscape of marginal marks, can appear as an invoked authority rather than a visible actor. A record might indicate that something was done under divine sanction, or that a divine category is the destination of a transfer, or that a sacred group's portion was adjusted. These references can function like legal language. They make the action legitimate in a worldview where legitimacy is tied to the divine. This brings us to a careful hypothesis that grows from small details rather than grand claims. What if the something bigger is not described because it sits outside the acceptable vocabulary of the institution? Instead of naming the threat, the institution names the response: sealing, withdrawal, relocation, restricted access, conditional transfers, special destinations. If the threat is too destabilizing, the records may focus on procedure and let procedure stand in for explanation. We also pay attention to lists that suddenly change ordering. Lists are a form of hierarchy. In a stable list, the order is familiar. When order changes, priorities change. If certain recipients move to the top, it suggests protection of key roles. If certain destinations begin to recur, it suggests consolidation. if certain sacred categories receive reduced or redirected portions. It suggests that ritual presence is being reconfigured. Another new development emerges when we think about bilingual or mixed language elements in texts. The presence of loan words or unusual spellings. Such features can reflect contact with outsiders, administrative reform, or emergency communication across regions. In a crisis, systems sometimes adopt whatever language is most efficient for coordination. If certain terms appear that feel imported, it can hint at new alliances, new control structures, or new pressures that forced interaction with unfamiliar groups. We remain cautious. Language change can happen for many reasons, but in combination with ceiling increases and relocation patterns, it can suggest a widening stress field, something that pushes the institution beyond its habitual boundaries. We now imagine a specific kind of record that will be produced in a high-pressure scenario, an inventory of sacred items prepared for movement. The list wouldn't need to proclaim fear. It would only need to enumerate item names, materials, containers, seals, carriers, destinations, witnesses. The act of listing is already an admission that loss is possible. You do not inventory what you assume will always be safe. You inventory what you might have to prove you safeguarded. In such a list, the Anunnaki might appear as the divine label attached to a set of objects or functions. The list might treat that label as an endpoint, a jurisdiction, a storage category. If so, then the escape is an administrative relocation of the sacred core under a divine name. We also consider the possibility that certain marginal notes indicate urgency in timing. A note that an item must depart immediately. A note that a portion was issued outside schedule. A note that a room was sealed ahead of calendar. These timing disruptions can indicate a pressure that does not respect ritual cycles. Floods do not wait for festivals. Armies do not pause for offerings. Disease does not observe calendars. When timing breaks, the institution reveals that it is reacting. The atmosphere becomes intimate here, almost microscopic. A single wedge pressed deeper than the others. A sign added in a different style. A correction squeezed into a narrow margin. These are the fingerprints of a system trying to stay coherent, while the outside grows incoherent. We end with the feeling of standing over a tablet that is technically complete, yet quietly tense. The main lines look orderly. The margins carry the strain. The seal impression is crisp, as if someone pressed hard. The record doesn't tell us the name of the bigger pressure. It tells us how people behaved when they felt it. One question remains, soft and unresolved, like a note written too small to read without light. If the margins show conditional transfers and tightened authority, what kind of threat makes an institution rely on silence in its main lines and confession in its smallest marks? We enter the final phase of the evidence through a word that feels like a door closing, not a dramatic word, not a mythic name, but the language of consensus and completion. Institutions end actions with confirmations. Received, counted, verified, sealed, filed. Those endings are supposed to stabilize the world. Yet, when a system is under pressure, endings begin to multiply. More items are sealed, more rooms are closed, more transfers are finalized. The paperwork becomes a series of small conclusions, as if the institution is preparing for the possibility that it will not be able to write tomorrow. A new development emerges when we treat final sealings as continuity plans. A sealing can be used to secure a jar for ordinary storage, but it can also be used to lock away what must endure. Archives themselves can be sealed. Doors to record rooms can be closed under authority. Duplicate copies of key texts can be prepared and deposited in safer locations. This is not romantic speculation. It is a known behavior of bureaucracies. When risk rises, they protect the record, because the record is legitimacy. We consider the act of consolidation. In stable times, administration is distributed. Many rooms, many storehouses, many scribal desks. In unstable times, systems consolidate. They move critical assets to fewer nodes. They reduce the number of entry points. They centralize seals. They tighten the chain of custody. Consolidation is a form of retreat that does not look like running. It looks like efficiency. But in context, it can be a defensive measure. Now we return to the Anunnaki as a category of authority, but in a more subtle role. At the end of a cycle of relocation, a system needs to declare that divine legitimacy remains intact. If sacred assets are moved, the move must be framed not as loss, but as authorized transition. The institution may perform rituals of closure, rituals of transfer, rituals that declare a new seat of presence. The language used can sound like divine decision, divine travel, divine withdrawal from a place that can no longer sustain the proper order. This is where the idea of escaping something bigger becomes a soft conclusion rather than a claim. The records and behaviors we have traced are consistent with a managed withdrawal under pressure, a relocation of portable legitimacy, a tightening of access, and an emphasis on sealing and verification. The specific nature of the pressure remains uncertain, and we keep it that way. The evidence suggests a crisis large enough to force institutions to plan for continuity away from their familiar centers. A new development appears when we think about continuity as a social contract. Temples do not exist alone. They are embedded in communities. When a temple consolidates and relocates its core, it leaves people behind. Those people need a story that explains why the sacred presence feels diminished. They need a framework that allows grief without dissolving trust. Divine withdrawal language can serve that function. It tells the population that the absence is not abandonment out of indifference, but a necessary movement within a larger order. This is a delicate point. It can sound like manipulation, but it can also be sincere. Leaders may truly believe that divine presence is tied to correct procedure and safe conditions. If the city cannot maintain correct conditions, then moving the sacred core may be understood as preserving the divine relationship rather than breaking it. The procedure becomes a form of care. We now examine the final sealing in a more tactile way. A room is closed. A clay sealing is applied to a latch. A cylinder seal is rolled. The impression is clean. The clay is pressed firmly, as if the person sealing it wants it to hold. The sealing will harden. To open the door later, someone must break it, and the break will be visible. This is trust, engineered into matter. A similar logic applies to archives. A sealed archive is a bet on the future. It assumes someone will return. It assumes continuity will be restored. It assumes there will be a later reader who cares enough to examine a broken sealing and understand that the break mattered. In crisis, sealing is both defense and hope. We consider how such endings might be remembered in later generations. A controlled relocation can become a myth of divine departure. A consolidation of sacred objects can become a story of gods traveling. A closure ritual can become a narrative of a council deciding fate. This is not a reduction of myth into bureaucracy. It is an acknowledgement that human societies often store their operational memories inside sacred language, because sacred language lasts longer than logistics. The Anunnaki, then, can be read as both theology and institution, as a divine council in story and as a category of legitimacy in practice. If the system behaved as though that legitimacy could be moved, sealed, and preserved, then the escape is not a wild flight. It is an organized withdrawal. We come to the final question that lingers like a sealed door left behind. If the records show careful closure, consolidation, and portable legitimacy, why does the tradition speak as if the gods were leaving in haste or in sorrow? Perhaps because, for the people remaining, any relocation of a sacred presence feels like abandonment. Even when it is planned, the procedure can be perfect, and the grief can still be real. We end in a quiet space where the last seal has been pressed, and the last tablet has been filed. The storerooms that mattered most are empty because their contents have moved. The shrine that anchored daily life is clean, but inactive. The officials have done what they could. The institution has made itself smaller and more mobile. The city around it waits in uncertainty. One question remains, placed gently in the darkness like a lamp turned low. If a system can preserve its sacred authority by sealing it and carrying it away, what becomes of the place that was once the center? And what unseen pressure was powerful enough to make leaving feel like the only form of continuity? We slow our breathing now. The evidence has been laid out in quiet pieces, like tablets arranged on felt. Nothing here demands panic. Nothing here demands a single answer. The night can hold ambiguity without becoming dangerous. We can let the idea of a managed withdrawal rest in the mind as a possibility, not a verdict. We can accept that ancient institutions were both spiritual and practical, and that their records can carry both awe and procedure in the same lines. If you are listening from somewhere quiet tonight, it can help to imagine the archive once more, not as a place of threat, but as a place of careful preservation. The clay is cool, the seal impressions are crisp, the shelves are steady. Whatever pressures once moved through those cities, they are not moving through your room. They are only patterns in text, patterns in clay, patterns in the way humans tried to keep meaning intact when the world around them became uncertain. We can picture a sealed door that was meant to be reopened, not as a symbol of doom, but as a symbol of hope. Someone believed there would be a return. Someone believed continuity would resume. The act of sealing was not only defense, it was trust in a future reader. So we let the Anunnaki become what the evidence allows them to be in this gentle hour. A council in story, an authority in ritual, a category in administration, a way of saying that decisions were made with weight and care. And we let the something bigger remain unnamed, because naming is not required for rest. It is enough to know that people responded with procedures, with consolidation, with records meant to outlast the moment. The room around you is safe. The night is steady. The investigation can fade like ink drying on clay, becoming quiet and inert. We can leave the archive door closed, not in fear, but in peace. And let the mind drift away from wedges and seals and corridors of dust into a softer darkness that does not demand anything from you. End of script. Good night.